All right, we're back at 14 minutes after as we've been covering explosive headlines out regarding Bank of America chief Ken Lewis's testimony. He is saying Ben Bernanke and Henry Paulson pressured him to hide key information about financial woes at Merrill Lynch. Keep in mind, this is testimony to New York State Attorney General Andrew Cuomo. Now, obviously, the implications of this story are great. Now, we have a couple of angles for you. In a few minutes, we'll be talking to Tom Ajami to explore the legal side of this story. But first up, our own Lindsay Arendt joins us from Washington for the political take on this really explosive story. Lindsay.
Well, Carol, according to the Journal story, Lewis said under oath that he believed Hank Paulson and Ben Bernanke were instructing him to keep silent while Bank of America was negotiating government funding to absorb Merrill's huge losses, which, as we all know, later turned out to be almost $16 billion in the fourth quarter. Now, the government wanted Ken Lewis to complete the takeover to save Merrill, and the risk was that a leak could have derailed the entire deal. So the big questions that arise when it comes to this story is whether the government went too far, and if so, what, if anything, can be done about it at all. I spoke to Chris Whalen of Institutional Risk Analytics, and he says Bernanke and Paulson were acting far outside the bounds of their authority, and as such, he says they were exposing themselves to claims that shareholders basically could sue both men for. Craig Donoghue of CME Group appeared on Bloomberg Television today, and he says the key here is that the shareholder should always come first.
Obviously, we think, disclosure to shareholders is of the utmost importance and of paramount concern. I don't know how one would, balance the competing interests of complying with the securities laws with the interests of certain people in government.
Now, one point that Gary Townsend of Hill Townsend Capital made to me today is that regulatory reports that are specific to the banking sector have historically been unavailable to the public. That is to say, they've been exempt from Freedom of Information Act requests. Congress made that determination, he said, in the late 80s for the specific purpose of protecting sensitive information regarding banks and to keep that information from being politicized. And he says there's likely to be congressional hearings on this issue, and you're likely to see Paulson and Bernanke both brought in to testify before lawmakers. But his point basically is that it's normal for the government to try to keep this kind of information away from the public domain for political reasons. Mark, back to you.
Lindsay Arendt in Washington. For more on Ken Lewis's testimony on the Merrill Lynch deal, Tom Ajami, a securities lawyer and managing partner at Ajami LLP in Houston, joins us. Mr. Ajami represents pension funds and retirement funds in litigation and arbitration cases. Mr. Ajami, welcome to Bloomberg News. And I thought I'd begin with something that Lindsay Arendt just played. Craig Donoghue of CME saying that shareholders should always come first. What happened here?
Absolutely right, Mark. Look, the shareholders are the owners. Let's just call them owners because that's what they are. And let's call Ken Lewis what he is. He's an employee. He works at the company for the owners. And every executive knows that his #1 responsibility is to the owners of the company, to no one else. He's there to work for them. And he has an absolute obligation, he knows this too, to disclose all material information. He can't hide the fact that he's about to acquire a company, Merrill Lynch, that's extremely rickety and maybe even about to collapse.
Well, given
he has to tell the shareholders and the owners that.
Well, given this information, sir, should shareholders pursue claims against the government?
No, they shouldn't. I don't think Ken Lewis is. I think he said he thought that the government was telling him to do certain things. But I highly doubt, in fact, I have serious reservations that the Secretary of the Treasury and the head of the Federal Reserve said, hey, Ken Lewis, break the law. Don't tell your shareholders things. Break the law as we all know it. They never told him to do that.
But, Tom, Carol Massar here with Mark, no doubt about it that Mr. Lewis was under an awful lot of pressure. I mean, it was just, from what I understand, an earlier story that, they were pressuring, Ben Bernanke and Hank Paulson were pressuring Ken Lewis, saying, you're going to lose your job. The board's going to be replaced unless you do that Merrill deal. I mean, there was a lot of pressure on these guys. So maybe they didn't explicitly come out and say, you got to do this or you got to lie. But there was an awful lot of pressure there. And that has to be questioned.
Well, I sure hope that Ken Lewis's defense here isn't that I decided not to tell the owners of the company what was going on and not to disclose material facts because I might lose my job. Then he's putting himself first. If that were the case, he should have stepped down. His responsibility is not to himself and not to make sure he makes tens of millions of dollars and keeps a fancy lifestyle. His responsibility is to his shareholders, #1.
Well, who's really then at fault in your view? Just 30 seconds before we have to take a break. Is it Ken Lewis? Is it Ben Bernanke? Is it Paulson? Or is it all of them, potentially?
Well, no, it's Ken Lewis, and it's Bank of America. Look, it's a poorly run company. If it were well run, we wouldn't be bailing it out. You and I and everyone else in this country wouldn't bail them out. they were going to collapse unless they took our tax dollars. So it's a poorly run company. Let's just admit it. And
Okay.
number two, he's going down in history as making two terrible acquisitions, Countrywide and Merrill.
Tom, sit tight. We're going to come back and talk some more. We're talking with Tom Ajimi. All right, we're taking a break, everyone. We're back in 2 minutes' time. All right, welcome back, everybody. I do want to get to some more of those headlines crossing from New York State Attorney General Andrew Cuomo talking about Bank of America CEO Ken Lewis, testimony that Mr. Lewis gave to Cuomo. Now, Cuomo's saying that Fed officials pressured Lewis not to end the Merrill deal. Remember that happening, really the culmination of that deal happening late last year. Also, he says, Cuomo saying Lewis says the Fed threatened to oust his board if the deal ended. He also says he doesn't have a complete picture of the Fed role in this issue. You remember the Wall Street Journal article this morning talking about pressure from Ben Bernanke of the Fed and also Hank Paulson on Mr. Lewis in terms of completing that Merrill deal. Let's get more reaction. Tom Ajami of Ajami LLP is still with us. So, Tom, you've got Cuomo coming out saying Lewis said that the Fed threatened to oust his board if the deal ends. What are you saying? That Ken should have said, you know what, so what? I'm going to lose my job. The board's going to get ousted, but I'm going to be truthful to my shareholders. Is that what he should have done?
That's his legal obligation. I mean, by law, and he knows this full and well, and everyone in corporate America knows this, is your number one responsibility is to the owners of the company. Either that or he should have worked out some way to release a certain amount of information to his owners. He can't sit there and be quiet just because he wants to keep his job, and those are the wrong priorities. The Bank of America doesn't exist so Ken Lewis can make money. Bank of America exists for its depositors, the people who put money there, and it exists for its owners, its shareholders.
Mr. Ajami, it's Mark again. I was wondering, I realize we might be getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but I guess it begs the question, what's the political fallout in Washington for Ben Bernanke and maybe even for the former head Hank Paulson?
Yeah. Well, great question, Mark. I mean, look, what Ken Lewis has done is he's pulled these two guys into the fight. I mean, now he's sort of putting a spotlight on the secretary or the former secretary of the Treasury and the current head of the Federal Reserve and pulling them into this whole dispute right now. It's very strange. You know, when Enron was going down and collapsing and WorldCom were collapsing, they all blamed their lawyers and their accountants. I think Ken Lewis gets a record award here now for taking it to a higher height of a fight. He's not going to just blame his lawyers and all the other people that worked for him. Now he wants to blame the head of the Federal Reserve and the secretary of the Treasury.
Tom Ajami, managing partner of Ajami LLP, joining us from Houston. Thanks.